The universe is so vast that it exceeds our wildest imaginations. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies. Each galaxy, in turn, contains hundreds of billions of stars. Surrounding many of those stars are planets. And on a significant portion of these planets, conditions must be very suitable for life. Statistically, the universe should be teeming with civilizations far older and more advanced than our own. So, where is everybody? This question once haunted the physicist Enrico Fermi. Now, the obsession with that eerie silence pierces deep into the mind of Julian Hayes in the middle of the loudest coffee shop in the city of San Francisco. Amidst billions of streams of scheduled data and the crowds rushing past one another, the 34-year-old engineer suddenly sinks into a suffocating panic. The world outside is so noisy and crowded, yet why is the space inside him so empty, exhausted, and terrifyingly still? The coffee cup on the table has long since grown cold, while the laptop screen continues to flash lines of artificial intelligence code and countless urgent work messages. Julian sits at the epicenter of progress, where human civilization shines brightest, yet he feels like a star that has exhausted its energy. We often assume that silence is a sign of peace, but the silence within Julian at this moment is the infinite void of a collapsing system. He recognizes a brutal fracture in reality as his hands typing on the keyboard suddenly feel foreign, as if they belong to a soulless biological machine. Julian possesses everything that modern society craves: a brilliant career and superior algorithms capable of changing the world, yet he has lost all connection to his own existence. His mind once stretched as far as a constantly expanding galactic empire, nabbing more information, processing data, and conquering new goals, yet at the core of that empire, no one remained to rule. Anxiety surges, wringing the last bits of oxygen from his lungs and forcing him to face a painful paradox: the more we try to cram the world into our heads, the more we lose ourselves. The relentless desire to rise has turned the human soul into an invisible realm of silence, where signals for help are swallowed by the black hole of exhaustion. This panic is not a random illness that strikes by chance. It is the scream of an internal ecosystem begging to stop, pleading for the right not to respond to the relentless assault of the outside world. Unable to endure the suffocation of hollow achievements any longer, Julian snaps his laptop shut, stands up abruptly, and hurries out of the cafe. He rushes into the foggy street, leaving behind the clatter of cups, meaningless conversations, and the entire noisy world that demands he keep functioning. Julian does not know where he is going, but deep in his subconscious, he understands that he must escape this chaotic orbit to seek an answer for the silence eroding his soul, a liberation from the trap of the illusions he so painstakingly built. Sitting behind the wheel of his convertible, Julian presses the accelerator and speeds away, leaving behind the thick fog of San Francisco to head south along the windswept Pacific Coast Highway. The roar of the engine sounds like a desperate effort to drown out the terrifying silence gnawing at his mind. Each mile passed is a gradual shedding of the cradle of Silicon Valley, the place celebrated as the most brilliant symbol of human expansionist ambition. There, people believe that every limit can be broken with a new line of code, a software update, or an exponential scaling strategy. We have molded ourselves into entities that never know enough, always obsessed with occupying more digital space, accumulating more data, and stretching the tentacles of our careers further. Julian was no exception, having spent his youth constantly pushing his own boundaries, conquering one peak after another with the naive belief that fulfillment lay at the end of the road of endless growth. But as the car slides through winding curves, taking him deep into the great primeval forests of Big Sur, a naked truth begins to take shape amidst the waves crashing against the cliffs. The greatness of nature here does not come from a weary effort to expand, but from a profound rooting in the present moment. The giant redwoods, standing tall through the centuries, do not long to become another species, nor do they bother to prove their survival value to anything around them. They are simply existing, radiant in the most natural wholeness of a living being. In contrast to that exquisite stillness, Julian's mind exposes a recurring tragedy of our time. We believe that filling our schedules with countless meetings, filling virtual spaces with thousands of superficial relationships, and filling the future with visions of grand success will help dispel the fear of our small existence. Yet, that very process of unceasing expansion is a process of self-depletion, a conquest that impoverishes the soul. The more he tried to expand his personal kingdom, the more Julian realized he was merely ruling over a desolate land full of anxiety and depletion. He had forced his biological machine to operate at a speed that nature never designed, leading to a nervous system always in a state of red alert, scanning for threats from unfinished projects and unmet expectations. In a frantic effort to conquer the future, he had inadvertently turned the present into a cold, abandoned wasteland. The waves of the Pacific Ocean still patiently beat against the shore, unhurried and unpressed, as if whispering an ancient message that the busy human mind has long forgotten. The progress we worship day and night is actually just a perfect illusion of the wheel of reincarnation, where we run desperately, dripping with sweat, only to realize we are still in the same place with a soul that is empty and worn out. Julian tightens his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes staring blankly toward the horizon where the ocean merges with the vast, boundless sky. He feels his chest heavy with the weight of the masks of glory he has had to wear for so long. Escaping the noisy orbit is not merely an impulsive, aimless trip, but an instinctive effort of a living being to find a safe haven for the system to be allowed to stop, to have the right to break down and thaw. The world of technology had infected his mind with the toxic belief that a person's value is measured by what they can produce, optimize, and control absolutely. But at the end of this world of data, amidst the wild and authentic nature, no superior algorithm can process deep sadness, and no smart application can update the version of a heart cracking from weariness. We often mistakenly believe that we need to go further and reach higher to find eternal peace, but perhaps what we truly need is the extraordinary courage to stop, to remove the heavy armor of expectation, and to face the silent space within without judgment or fear. The car glides under the shade of ancient trees, allowing the late afternoon sunlight to pierce through the leaves and cast dappled light on Julian's pale face, as if illuminating the fragments of a newly collapsed and cracked illusion. He realizes that his entire journey of racing against time was like a desperate effort to fill the ocean with a tiny, frothy spoon. The more effort he spent, the more clearly the helplessness and emptiness appeared. Perhaps it is time for the young man to learn to stop reaching outward and begin an inward exploration, going deep into the core of existence where no data needs to be processed, no achievements need to be reported, but only breath, heartbeats, and the sacred presence of the eternal present moment. The convertible shudders for a moment, wobbles, and then fades away in the quiet space of the Big Sur mountains as the fuel gauge reaches empty without him noticing. Julian has no choice but to pull over at an old rest stop nestled among the giant trees, where time seems to have stopped flowing centuries ago. Here, amidst the drifting mist and the earthy scent of moss, he encounters Arthur Vance, a 68-year-old man who is leisurely brewing tea on a rusty wood stove. Arthur was once a renowned professor of astrophysics, but now he chooses a secluded life, shedding all academic glory to immerse himself in the primordial rhythm of the universe. In stark contrast to Julian's scowling face and extreme tension, as he frantically waves his lifeless phone looking for a faint signal, Arthur radiates an extraordinary calm, tinged with the wit of someone who has understood the persistent jokes of nature. The 34-year-old engineer cannot hide his frustration, beginning to pour out shrill complaints about the irrational breakdown, the stalled strict schedule, the artificial intelligence projects calling his name back in Silicon Valley, and the world that seems about to collapse just because he has been absent for a few hours. We are always imprisoned in the arrogant illusion that we are the center of the universe, that if we stop, the turning of the earth will fall out of rhythm and crumble. But Arthur only smiles gently, his eyes narrowing with a great tolerance. He slowly adds wood to the fire and leisurely pours a steaming cup of tea, handing it to Julian. He does not join in the stranger's panic, nor does he offer any cliché advice on how to fix the car or optimize time like cheap self-help books. Instead, with a voice deep and rhythmic like the breath of the forest itself, he begins to slowly peel away the layers of proud armor that Julian is desperately clinging to. Arthur evokes a painful paradox that modern humans can boast about inventing the most complex algorithms to manage billions of data streams in an instant, but are completely helpless in calming a single toxic, wandering thought in their own minds. The old professor likens Julian's frantic busyness to a star wasting its entire life energy just to emit desperate flares into an empty, cold space where no one bothers to watch. Julian's extreme fatigue does not actually come from the massive workload he carries, but from a deeper tragedy where he has identified his entire sacred self with achievements that can be measured by material things. We frequently make the disastrous mistake between truly existing and having to constantly prove our existence through numbers, massive projects, and vain praises. As he sips the tea, bitter at the tip of the tongue but leaving a deep sweet aftertaste, Julian suddenly feels a strange pause in the chaotic and noisy torrent of his thoughts. He looks up at Arthur, a 68-year-old man who does not own any smart devices, has no urgent schedule to complete, yet carries within him a richness, stability, and freedom that Julian has never once tasted in all his years of striving for the peak of fame. The conversation between them flows naturally, not as a win-lose debate or a dry, forced sermon, but like a cool stream gently weaving through the cracks of a parched and shattered soul. Arthur skillfully uses the infinite concepts of space to narrow down Julian's problems, turning petty complaints about work into profound self-questioning about the true purpose of progress. He gently raises a doubt: are we laboriously creating technology to serve the freedom of life, or are we voluntarily turning ourselves into diligent machines just to serve the endless expansion of the technological wheel? In that moment of stillness, in the vast quiet space where only the crackling of firewood and the rustling of wind through the leaves could be heard, Julian begins to dimly perceive the utter absurdity in his way of existence for so long. He had unconsciously fled to the end of the data world, to a place where the boundaries of civilization had no phone signal, only to be arranged by the universe to meet a stranger who seemed to thoroughly understand the emptiness he was carrying alone. Arthur's presence, steady as a mountain, not only calms the irrational rage of an ego struggling in a dead end but also slowly opens a wide philosophical door leading Julian into deep inner dimensions. At the end of this data world, old prejudices about success, failure, busyness, and rest are trembling, waiting to be broken and redefined from the beginning, bringing a lost soul back to its own original stillness. Sitting cross-legged on the porch of the rustic wooden house as darkness begins to pull the curtain of silence over the old forest, Arthur looks up at the first stars glimmering through the leaves. He slowly repeats the question that has haunted generations of scientists: if the universe is so brilliant and infinite, why have we remained enveloped in an eerie silence until now? The old professor calmly introduces Julian to a classic concept in astrophysics called the Great Filter, a cruel invisible wall, a stage of desperate deadlock that almost no civilization can overcome to reach the stars. It is like a bottleneck where all evolutionary efforts are crushed before they can spread throughout the galaxy. Julian listens intently, his mind, accustomed to logical data, beginning to be drawn into a more macroscopic perspective. However, Arthur has no intention of lecturing on the distant universe. He is borrowing the lens of the stars to shine a light directly into the black hole raging inside the young guest's mind. With a kind smile, he gently flips the problem, pointing out that we always look at the sky to find the great filter without realizing it is silently operating right in this modern era, right in Julian's own chest. The extreme exhaustion, the collapse of the nervous system that Julian calls a panic attack or a deadlock, is actually the great filter of a modern mind that never stops desiring expansion. Julian always tormented himself, believing he suffered from a terrible psychological illness, a serious software bug that needed immediate patching so the body machine could continue the productivity wheel. But Arthur gently shattered that harsh illusion. He dissected the truth that Julian was not broken, he was not ill, but he was simply slamming into the final boundary, the absolute biological and spiritual limit of unceasingly moving forward. We have deceived ourselves with an arrogant paradox that humans can grow infinitely within a finite biological entity. Society always urges us to reach further, to consume more information, and to achieve greater milestones, like a species desperately expanding its internal territory. But the human brain, miraculous as it may be, was not designed to contain the entire noise of the universe. When we force our minds to constantly produce, connect, and optimize, we are pushing ourselves into an evolutionary trap where growth exceeds the life form's capacity to endure. The state of empty exhaustion Julian tasted in the cafe was not a punishment for weakness, but an instinctive defense mechanism of life when it refuses to be wrung dry. The great filter in psychology does not appear as a destructive explosion, but manifests as a silent erosion, a slow depletion where the brightest souls burn themselves out on the altar of progress. Arthur's explanation resonated steadily, blending with the rustling leaves, smiling and easing the heavy boulder pressing on Julian's chest. He suddenly realized that his panic was not a betrayal by his body, but the most sincere plea of a living being reclaiming the right to be a normal human, allowed to be weak, allowed to be tired, and allowed to stop before the invisible line of the universe. We do not need to try to break the great filter by bracing ourselves to be stronger, because sometimes reaching the limit is not to remind us of failure, but to soothe us that it is time to let go of distant illusions of control to return and care for the life that is gasping for air at this very moment. The night wind, carrying the chill from the Pacific Ocean, blows across the porch, bringing an ultimate relief as Julian finally allows himself to stop playing the role of an all-powerful god to embrace the beautiful finitude of a human being made of flesh and bone. As the internal resistance fades, the invisible wall of the great filter is no longer a death sentence for unfinished ambitions, but has transformed into a sacred protected boundary, keeping his soul from dissolving into the meaningless void of endless demands. As the flickering flames dance in the deep darkness of the old forest, casting warm light on two faces, Arthur tosses another piece of dry wood into the stove and borrows the image of the fire bravely resisting the cold of the night to lead Julian into another great principle of the universe. The old professor calmly mentions the thermodynamic law of the inevitable destruction of time, called chaos or entropy. He slowly explains that everything in this vast universe, if left to float freely, has a natural tendency to move toward a state of decay, ruin, and disorder. To form the miracles of life, to build a glorious civilization, or simply to maintain the existence of a tree with a canopy reaching high for sunlight, that structure must absorb and consume a massive source of energy to maintain order and constantly resist the cruel pull of that chaos. With a tolerant yet insightful gaze, Arthur applies this cold physical law to the human mental ecosystem, pointing out the harsh truth that Julian's current life has become too complex, crowded, and full of heavy artificial structures. The talented young engineer had spent his youth building a massive empire for himself, including countless brilliant professional ambitions, digital and real-world assets that needed constant management, tangled social relationships, and endless perfect expectations of a bright future. We are frequently encouraged, even forced by modern society, to constantly reap more things and add more titles, unintentionally forgetting an inevitable physical consequence: the greater the complexity of the system, the more massive and continuous spiritual energy is required to maintain that shimmering but fake order. Every unreturned email, every line of artificial intelligence code waiting for a fix, Every mask of indifferent success Julian had to brace himself to wear every day entering the office were all silently draining his vitality like energy-hungry machines with no end. His mind had actually had to work at a terrifying capacity, exceeding thousands of times the level our ancestors ever experienced, just to keep the sandcastle of personal illusions from crumbling before the storms of objective reality. And then, following the exact order of nature, what must come will come when the fuel reserves in the soul have reached empty, without even a little strength left to continue supporting the weight of the massive ambitions he created. The entire mental system will inevitably move toward the brink of self-collapse. The suffocating panic that trapped Julian in the noisy cafe earlier that morning, through the lens of all things, was no longer a sign of weakness or a shameful disease. It was simply the alarm bell of a thermodynamic calculation that could not be avoided. When energy is completely depleted, all the complex order he had labored to mold suddenly vanishes, giving way to the darkness of original chaos. We, in the intoxication of productivity, naively believe that we can skillfully bend every natural law with an iron will, with time management courses, or with extraordinary effort to overcome barriers, but in the end, nature always has its own way of reclaiming its inherent quiet balance. The exhaustion felt to the very bone is not a moral error or a pathetic personal decline, but the truest voice of a finite biological body urgently pleading to let go of burdens that do not belong to the core essence of life. Under Arthur's calm and wise illumination, Julian realized with a shock that he had pushed himself into a futile war, a battle of terrible energy consumption just to desperately protect invisible shadows reflected on a cliff wall. The collapse of the mental system, when viewed thoroughly, was actually an invaluable grace, a beautiful self-healing and protective mechanism of life, forcing him to manually dismantle the towering towers of expectation, reaching for the sky to return to pure simplicity, where the soul no longer has to borrow a little energy from tomorrow, just to struggle and linger in the moment of today. Sitting quietly before the dying fire giving way to glowing red embers, Julian's mind, though somewhat soothed by deep cosmic reasons, still followed a persistent habit and began to stir, looking for a practical solution. Like a machine programmed too perfectly to never accept failure, the young engineer rushed through his memory for dozens of productivity optimization methods, strict time management techniques, or the ubiquitous self-help books he had pored over. He began to mutter about having to rearrange his schedule, cut out unnecessary meetings, apply short-term meditation tricks to force his mind to regain focus, and even planned to reset his entire living routine just so his body machine could adapt and continue carrying that massive workload more intelligently and smoothly. Listening to those desperate calculations, Arthur chuckled, a laugh warm and gentle like dry leaves rubbing together in the quiet night breeze. The old professor calmly pointed out the invisible but cruel trap of the modern self-development industry, a sweet trap that has deceived millions of lost souls. We have been brainwashed by a toxic illusion that the only solution for exhaustion from doing too much is to learn how to do even more, but in a sophisticated form disguised as healing language. Society always whispers in our ears that if the engine is smoking from overload, what we need is not to take our foot off the gas, but to find a more expensive coolant, to download a more superior life management algorithm to continue rushing at a frantic speed. But Arthur gently exposed that lie by clarifying that trying to fix oneself through productivity techniques is actually the act of adding a new layer of complexity on top of a system already waiting to collapse. It forces life to consume more energy to monitor its own rest, turning even meditative sleep and moments of relaxation into tasks that must be completed, goals measurable by health indicators. Applying those industrial-style spiritual medicines not only fails to extinguish the fire but also pours oil on the flames of anxiety as we unintentionally commercialize even our own misery. The true first aid for a burning soul never lies in learning how to fight the fire better or trying to become a more solid fireproof suit. It lies in the art of absolute letting go of the excess energy blocks gripping life. Arthur advised Julian to bravely allow his internal system the right to break down, the right to stop functioning in an unfinished way, instead of constantly carrying more complexity with hopeless repair efforts. If you are carrying a heavy rock on your shoulder up an endless slope and feel your legs about to break, the wisest solution is not to take a core strength course or look for an ergonomic rock carrying posture, but simply to let go and let that rock roll into the abyss. The ultimate solution is not trying to become a more perfect version with more resilient endurance, but total surrender to one's natural limits, allowing oneself to freefall into the quiet space without needing to frantically cling to any rotten life buoy of fake success theories. When we stop struggling, stop looking for ways to fix what was never an error, only then can we truly touch the original piece where the masks fall off and the burden of having to be great vanishes into thin air, giving way to a relieved and free space that needs to prove nothing to this world. Under the deep night sky of the Big Sur forest, Julian quietly took a deep breath, feeling the clean air fill his lungs, and for the first time in his adult life, he accepted letting the machine in his head be fully powered down, refusing all responses, refusing all repairs, to rest in the exquisite imperfection of existence. The night slowly fell, a deep black velvet curtain enveloping the great redwood forest, leaving only red embers occasionally crackling, breaking the silence. In that vast darkness, Julian took a deep breath and confessed a secret fear heavy from the bottom of his heart about artificial intelligence, the superior technology he spent his energy molding every day in Silicon Valley. He confessed the haunting obsession that the superior lines of code created by him and his colleagues would one day spin out of control and coldly replace human existence, making all human evolutionary efforts meaningless. The feeling of manually crafting the nail for the coffin of his own species kept his soul burning in the fire of doubt and torment. Listening fully to the young engineer's confusion, Arthur slowly related that fear to a gruesome cosmic vision where civilizations may have manually wiped themselves out with super technologies they proudly created. The old professor explained that when a species reaches the peak of scientific progress, they hold power equal to the gods, but if their consciousness is still trapped in ignorance, fear, and the desire for dominance, then those great inventions, whether nuclear weapons or super-intelligent artificial intelligence, will become the cruel cause that ends the entire civilization before they can travel between the stars. But then, with a slow rhythm imbued with Eastern meditative character, Arthur skillfully curled that cosmic concept to shine directly onto Julian's internal psychological structure. He smoothly pointed out a naked and painful truth: the most brutal ghost of intelligence is not in the giant supercomputers out there, but is present right inside each of our skulls. Julian's outstanding intelligence, the great logical analysis ability that helped him stand at the peak of his career, was now acting exactly like a rebellious artificial intelligence system when it was completely absent of constant awareness. Like a peerless sharp sword without a scabbard, his mind, because it did not find enough challenges in the outside world, automatically turned the sharp point inward to cruelly judge, dissect, and gradually erode the very master who gave birth to it. We honor logical thinking, we train the brain to chop reality into small pieces for easy control, but we forget to teach the mind how to be still. A great mind, if not accompanied by a quiet, empty heart, will turn into a bloodthirsty tyrant imprisoning itself in the iron cage of endless wandering thoughts. Thinking is originally just a tool, a devoted servant, but when we allow it to dominate every corner of existence, it immediately usurps the throne and turns into a terrible master ruling the inner kingdom with the violence of anxiety and self-drawn disaster scenarios. Julian had honed his thinking capacity to perfection but had lost the ability to stop thinking. The risk of a soul's self-destruction does not necessarily stem from some sensational tragedy. It begins silently from the moment our brilliant brain mistakenly believes it is the entire being and starts to go against the natural flow of peace. When the last fire faded, casting flickering shadows on the cold ground, Julian suddenly shuddered with the realization that the greatest life and death battle of human life does not lie in racing with the rise of mindless machines, but in identifying and relaxing the very sharp intelligence that is frantically self-destructing within, so that he is not swallowed into the silent void by his own brilliant cleverness. Looking deep into Julian's eyes, which were trembling with internal shocks, Professor Arthur continued to lead the young man deeper into the psychological maze of his own to thoroughly dissect the structure of that cruel self-destruction. He pointed out that the extreme tearing Julian endured every day and every hour actually resembled a primitive tribal war taking place fiercely right under his skull. Like primitive species in the distant universe or human ancestors themselves, there is always a tendency to divide into hostile factions to fight for territory. Julian's internal territory was also being clearly divided into tribes with completely opposite and hateful ideologies. On one side was the ego longing for ultimate success, an invisible tyrant who never knew enough, always cracking the whip to urge him to reach the brilliant heights of Silicon Valley, to constantly prove his unique value with superior algorithms and projects with the stature of changing the world. On the other side of the battle line was the desperate and weak cry of a biological being that was worn out and exhausted, longing for rest, to shed all heavy responsibilities to sink into a dreamless sleep. Those two psychological tribes constantly equipped themselves with the weapons of judgment, accumulated the ammunition of anxiety, and continuously escalated a fierce internal arms race. Every time Julian intended to close his eyes and rest, the ambition tribe would fire with guilt and a cowardly sense of falling behind, making him jump up in panic. Conversely, when he tried to brace himself to work, the exhaustion faction would carpet bomb with raging headaches, lack of focus, and a suffocating sense of emptiness, stripping away all motivation to rise. Thus, the precious life energy of the talented young engineer was wrung to the last drop, not by pressure from the outside world, but by this bloody internal civil war with no end. To untie that tragedy, Arthur took a sip of bitter tea and outlined a philosophical vision imbued with Eastern thought combined with the macroscopic image of the universe, where the most advanced civilizations perhaps avoided the disaster of extinction because they evolved beyond divisive tribalism to reach a state called the hive mind. In that glorious state, billions of individuals no longer tore at each other but moved in rhythm within a common consciousness that contained all things without generating judgment or conflict of interest. The old professor calmly invited Julian to borrow that great model to apply to his own chaotic mental ecosystem. The only way out is definitely not to choose a side, not to use iron will to destroy laziness or use cold reason to crush vain ambition. We are always taught that we must fight negative thoughts, but the ironic truth is that any effort of resistance or suppression is only the act of adding fuel to the fire of conflict to burn more strongly. The most miraculous first aid medicine, the ultimate art of liberation, is actually very simple. It is the silent observation of every thought rising without identifying oneself with them. When the tribe of anxiety or ambition sounds the drum for battle, Julian only needs to softly take a step back, playing the role of a vast sky containing everything, allowing those thoughts the right to be present, to crackle, and then to self-generate and self-destruct without giving any label of judgment or resistance. Like lying on the grass watching storm clouds swirling across the sky, you do not need to reach out to drive the clouds away, nor do you need to be angry because the sky is raining. You only need to be present there, fully aware and overflowing with tolerance. As soon as we stop the division of right and wrong, stop dividing the entity into good and evil factions, that meaningless arms race will immediately lose its target and automatically dissolve. In the sacred stillness of the Big Sur forest, Arthur's teaching was like a clear stream washing away all worries, bringing a wonderful moment of enlightenment. Julian was shocked to realize he had been torturing himself because he always had to play the role of a dictatorial general on the internal battlefield, always nervous and afraid that some piece of his soul would rebel. But at that sacred moment when he decided to let his hands hang, refusing to join the war in his own mind, a boundless relief suddenly surged like a waterfall, embracing his entire weary being. True freedom never lies in Wiping out all anxiety, it brilliantly blooms right at the moment we smile and allow all the mixed sounds to speak, but no longer grant them the power to determine our own eternal silent essence. When the first rays of dawn timidly pierced through the thick fog of the Big Sur mountains, dyeing the vast ocean a shimmering gold, Julian stood silently on the cliff, listening to the murmur of the waves carrying the eternal breath of creation. The darkness of the long night and the horrific internal civil wars had temporarily receded, giving way to a clear space in the mind, but the remnants of thinking habits still crept awake. Casting his weary eyes toward the horizon where the sea and sky merged flawlessly, the young engineer asked Arthur a question that had always haunted him as well as all of humanity: why do humans, or any intelligent species out there in the universe, always carry a frantic urge to expand unceasingly? We always long to reach out of the cramped atmosphere to occupy distant stars, just like the way he personally spent his youth constantly expanding his career kingdom in Silicon Valley, conquering one peak after another without once knowing the two words enough. Is that a primitive survival instinct, an immutable evolutionary law that the universe has etched deep into the genetic code of every living thing, forcing us to continuously expand to resist extinction? Professor Arthur slowly stepped beside him, holding a warm cup of tea, his kind eyes taking in the cool early breeze, and began to flip that entire proud worldview with a sympathetic smile. He smoothly pointed out that we frequently make a disastrous mistake between the natural growth of a living being and bottomless expansionist greed. Look at the great redwoods behind us. They grow to a certain full height to catch the light, their roots deep in the ground to absorb nutrients, but they never develop an outrageous ambition to stretch their branches to the moon or to drain the groundwater of the entire forest. The extreme upward drive Julian was laboring under did not actually stem from any sacred natural essence. It was a sophisticated product molded by the fear of scarcity in modern society. We are living in a civilization that operates on the illusion of lack, where the capitalist system and the media constantly infect our heads with a toxic belief that resources are finite, success is a cramped pie, and if you do not continuously grab the bigger piece, you will be eliminated and fall into the disaster of extinction. The urge to run headlong forward, to accumulate more assets, fame, or data, is not the freedom of a soul stretching its wings, but actually a panicked defensive reaction of a living being imprisoned in the illusion of scarcity. Arthur used a whispering but sharp voice to dissect the truth that Julian did not actually long to write tens of thousands of new lines of artificial intelligence code. He was only running away from the vague fear of becoming useless, being left behind, and being stripped of his existential value. We are like travelers dying of thirst in a desert of mirages, constantly drinking the salty water of busyness to quench our thirst, but the more we drink, the more our throats burn. Arthur's explanation was like a lightning bolt tearing through the fog of prejudice in Julian's mind, helping him realize an ultimate liberating truth: the invisible pressure weighing on his shoulders was only a program that could be deleted, not an inescapable destiny. Expansion is not the ultimate purpose of the universe because the universe is already complete at this very moment. When we remove the lens of scarcity, we will see that this world is not a life and death arena where everyone must tear each other apart to survive, but a rich garden where every living being has enough space to bloom and exist. True peace will knock on the door as soon as Julian realizes he does not need to constantly expand his boundaries just to prove he has the right to live. He can completely choose to stop. Right at the line of the present, breathe the salty air of the ocean, and tell himself that what he has in his hands, his brain, heart, and breath, is already a most perfect fullness that no system of illusions has the right to take away. As the brilliant rays of early morning completely dispelled the mist over the Pacific Ocean, Arthur continued to take the story into a deeper branch of philosophy to fully decode the silence of the stars and also the stillness Julian was longing for. The old professor calmly mentioned a subversive hypothesis that the universe out there is silent not because civilizations have been destroyed in a catastrophic disaster, but because the most advanced species have actively chosen a state called stagnation. At the peak of development, Instead of continuing to build giant spaceships to invade neighboring galaxies, they found an absolute ecological stability and decided to turn inward to optimize peace instead of pursuing physical expansion. They no longer had any need to reach out to prove their power or existence to the vast universe. For a mind trained in a cradle of Silicon Valley like Julian, this concept of stagnation was truly a shock, a direct challenge striking a heavy blow to the entire core belief system he always worshipped. From childhood, we were always brainwashed that standing still means atrophy, regression, and death, while unceasing movement, production, and expansion are the expressions of a meaningful life. Julian felt every cell in his body shudder in resistance to the thought of letting go of growth, because if he did not work, did not optimize, did not rise, then who would he be in this swirling world? His intellect, accustomed to solving hawk-and-tough problems, was now utterly confused before a problem that required him not to provide any calculation. But Arthur, with a calm voice echoing like waves against a cliff, skillfully dissected that illusion by inviting him to see stagnation not as a shameful laziness or a pathetic failure, but as an ultimate art of living. The old professor explained that ultimate happiness sometimes does not take the form of resounding victories or loud applause, but takes the stationary shape of standing still and doing nothing. Like a tree that has rooted deep enough and spread its canopy wide enough, it no longer needs to struggle to grow higher than other trees just to compete for sunlight, but leisurely enjoys the cool breeze passing through its leaves. The silence of the universe turned out not to be the ruins of destruction, but the sigh of relief of entities that have fully matured, having realized that trying to fill the infinite space out there is a meaningless effort. They choose to be invisible to our life-scanning radars because they no longer emit noisy signals of greed or fear. Projecting that macroscopic lens onto the small reality of humans, Arthur smoothly soothed Julian's surging soul by pointing out that allowing oneself to rest, to stop the race for achievements, is not a humiliating surrender but the moment we step onto a new evolutionary rung of consciousness. We do not need to constantly emit signals seeking attention from society, nor do we need to build massive structures called careers just to hide the emptiness inside. Learning to accept stagnation is learning to strip away the fake power of the future over the present. When Julian begins to understand the beauty of stillness, he will realize that doing nothing, not creating any surplus value for the world in this moment, is a sacred privilege, a profound gratitude toward life. The engineer slowly closed his eyes, letting the sea breeze ruffle his hair, and in the wonderful stillness of dawn, he dimly felt a gentle liberation weaving through every fiber of his being. He realized that ultimate happiness is not a brilliant destination at the end of a weary road of expansion, but is the stillness right here in this place, when one stops demanding that reality be different and allows one's being to radiantly exist in a complete state without needing to add or subtract anything. Even though the morning rays had eased some of the tension, an invisible ghost still lurked in Julian's mind, the ultimate fear of being left behind. From deep in his subconscious, the engineer always held an iron belief molded by the Silicon Valley industry that the wheel of life was a machine moving in only one forward direction, and he always considered not moving forward to mean moving backward and dying. He feared silence because he equated it with destruction, with the pathetic failure of a useless person eliminated by the flow of time. Catching the still somewhat confused look of his young friend, Arthur gently set the teacup down on a mossy rock and spoke in a warm voice as if talking to a soul suffering many wounds. The old professor slowly untied that desperate knot by leading Julian to look deep into the great silence of the vast universe above. He pointed out that when we look up at the night sky and do not catch any noisy radio signals, we often shudder in fear that the stars are dead, that the void is a giant grave burying countless unfortunate civilizations. But the truth could be a much brighter and more glorious picture. Arthur helped him realize that silence is not failure or destruction, but a glorious state of an entity that is complete, no longer torn by outside needs. Smiling and explaining further, He used a metaphor that when a beautiful painting is finished, the talented painter will gently lay down the brush instead of frantically drawing extra lines just to prove he is still painting. Similarly, a truly mature living being will reach a sacred point of balance where it is no longer torn by desires to compensate for the inner deficiency by gathering fragments from the outside world. The stagnation and silence Julian was fearfully avoiding were actually the privilege of souls that had stopped being desperate beggars asking for society's recognition. We have been brainwashed to believe that the value of a human lies in the speed at which they create a streak of light in the sky, like a brilliant but short-lived shooting star that ends by burning itself to ashes. Yet, the brightest streak is not a sign of sustainable life but is often an expression of intense friction before fading. True happiness takes the form of a red dwarf star, burning quietly, calmly, and persistently for billions of years without needing to explode loudly for the universe to notice. Society always infects our heads with the horror of stagnation, regarding it as an incurable disease that needs to be eliminated, making humans always struggle in the iron cage of materialism and productivity algorithms. When we stop, the noise of the world dies down and we are forced to face our own silent void. That is when fear surges because we no longer see the achievement labels to define ourselves. But Arthur smoothly reminded him that the cup is only useful when it is empty in the middle, and a person only truly lives when they allow themselves to have empty spaces not filled by any goal or desire. His teaching gently peeled away the thorny layer of fear, helping Julian wake up and realize that his stopping to rest, his not chasing the latest data streams or not launching another technology update, was not a cowardly abandonment at all. It was the moment he granted himself the highest grace of creation, the right to exist as a purpose in itself, not as a tool to serve the blind progress of all things. When he stopped considering himself a machine needing continuous upgrades, the eerie silence in his mind suddenly transformed into an infinite realm of stillness, a holy land where life was allowed to breathe freely, not judged, not demanded, and not eroded by the anxiety of having to become someone greater in the future. He realized silence is not a space devoid of life, not a tragic ending, but is the space filled with the purest presence, where he was truly complete right from the moment he allowed himself to let go of every desperate effort to become complete. To let those new thoughts slowly take root in his consciousness, Julian followed Arthur's leisurely footsteps deep into the great forest, where giant redwood trunks stood tall, catching the sunlight. Under the pristine, shaded canopy, the quiet of the forest did not bring a sense of isolation but instead protected and embraced the two small beings walking on the damp moss carpet. The old professor looked up at the vast, towering canopy and borrowed the greatness of nature to lead the story to another absolute boundary of the universe, the physical boundary established in the special theory of relativity. With a voice echoing in calm, he slowly repeated an immutable principle that any object with mass in this universe, when it wants to accelerate and reach the speed of light, will hit an insurmountable barrier. As that object moves faster, its mass increases, and therefore it requires an increasingly massive amount of energy to continue maintaining acceleration. And to truly reach the speed of light, that object would need an infinite energy source, something completely impossible in physical terms. That cruel law shapes the entire structure of reality, imprisoning every civilization within the shores of finitude, but is a perfect metaphor for the spiritual tragedy Julian was desperately struggling through. The old professor turned to look directly into the weary eyes of the engineer, pointing out that the ambition to control every variable of the future, the longing to reach absolute perfection in every artificial intelligence project, and Julian's desire to never make a mistake were actually a frantic effort to break the speed of light of the mind. We are always urged by society to predict every risk, to be ahead of the times, to outline perfect, flawless plans to ensure an absolutely safe future. But every effort to calculate the future in advance, every backup scenario Julian drew in his head, added another layer of invisible mass onto his mind. The more he tried to speed up his thinking to keep up with the unpredictable changes of the tech world, the heavier and more sluggish his mind became, requiring a massive amount of spiritual energy to continue functioning. Yet, the biological limit of humans does not possess an infinite source of energy. Trying to wring oneself dry to achieve complete control and flawless perfection is forever a physical illusion that will surely lead to the collapse and fragmentation of the entire nervous system, exactly like the panic attack that tore his reality in the noisy cafe that morning. That ambition is not a sign of superiority, but an expression of a bitter refusal of the natural limits of the human condition. We pile on our shoulders the burden of an omnipotent God, delusional that by superior logical analysis ability, we can overcome every boundary of space and time, manipulating every result according to our will. But reality is originally a chaotic, indeterminate flow that never submits to any control equation. Arthur's words echoed in the quiet space of the redwood forest like gentle hammer blows shattering the final wall of pride in Julian's consciousness. He suddenly realized that his extreme anxiety for so long stemmed from carrying too much mass, the mass of expectations, of the ego longing for recognition, and of the illusion of controlling all things. When he tried to accelerate that mental machine full of mass to the speed of light, the breakdown was an inevitable law that could not be avoided. Under the deep green canopy filtering dapples of sunlight, Julian took a deep breath, letting the spectacular clean scent of wood fill his lungs, and a feeling of unparalleled relief spread through his neurons. For the first time, he viewed his finitude not as a defect to be hidden, but as a deeply human protective boundary. Like these ancient trees that never try to grow faster than their roots can endure, humans can only find peace when they accept giving up the effort to become light to happily be an object of modest mass floating calmly in the primordial rhythm of the universe. Still walking under the sheltering shade of the great redwood trees, Julian continued to sink deep into the wonderful stillness newly opened in his consciousness. Professor Arthur noticed the loosening on the once tense shoulders of the young man and gently brought the conversation to the core of a deepest philosophical paradox of existence, the boundary between imprisonment and freedom. With a voice echoing the wisdom of years, he continued to borrow the lens of astrophysics to shine a light on the human condition, pointing out that all of humanity in general, and Julian in particular, were actually being imprisoned in the strict laws of space and time. We are stuck on a tiny planet rotating around a mediocre star at the edge of a quiet galaxy, and each individual is locked inside a biological machine that can only beat a few billion heartbeats in a short human life. From the dawn of civilization, humans have always considered this finitude to be a cruel life sentence, a physical prison that we must use every means to escape. We frantically create technology to extend life, invent super-fast means of transportation, and drain resources to nurture the dream of conquering distant, brilliant planetary systems. Julian's mind also once functioned according to that desperate pattern, as he always considered the limits of his strength, time, or intellect to be hostile shackles that needed iron will to smash. He once believed that absolute freedom meant being able to control every variable, manipulate every result, and expand his influence to an infinite level. But when his bare feet touched the damp moss under the ancient tree, a new and clear stream of awareness flooded his veins, completely breaking that arrogant prejudice. The old professor calmly analyzed that if the universe was truly designed with cruel distances to the point that no civilization could cross, then the isolation between the stars was not a punishment but the primordial architecture of reality. The most wise civilizations, instead of crying and struggling before the impassable boundary of the speed of light, smiled and accepted that imprisonment, turning their own tiny home into a stationary paradise. They did not consider the massive space separating the stars to be a barrier preventing freedom, but a great protective embrace, keeping each spark of intelligence burning brightly in its own territory without needing to tear each other apart. Looking directly and bowing respectfully before the physical and spiritual limits of oneself did not bring a sense of pathetic failure, but on the contrary, it untied every shackle of expectation, bringing Julian a feeling of strange and brilliant liberation he had ever tasted. He suddenly realized he did not need to become the Lord of the universe, did not need to carry the responsibility of designing an all-powerful artificial intelligence to save or change the world, and did not need to force himself to be present at every hot spot of the future. We frequently turn ourselves into miserable prisoners not because of the limits of creation, but because of the frantic desire to deny those limits. His exhaustion throughout the years of mulling over fame was actually the consequence of a creature with mass always longing to fly with the speed of invisible light particles. When Julian stopped biting the bars of finitude, stopped demanding his body and mind reach further than their core capacity, the invisible cage suddenly vanished into thin air. He realized he was a finite biological being, weak, vulnerable, and bound by time, but right inside that tiny and fragile limit contained the entire sacred wholeness of a human life. True freedom never lies in breaking every line to vanish into indeterminate space, but it sprouts brilliantly right at the moment we reside fully within our own boundaries, finding infinite serenity in just being an ordinary human breathing under the shade of an ancient tree, not needing to prove, not needing to rise, and completely at peace with his own beautiful helplessness before the vast universe. The silence under the ancient canopy seemed to become thicker and thicker, carrying a miraculous healing energy, taking Julian to the climax of this entire philosophical therapy process. Professor Arthur stopped, turned to look directly at the young man with an eye overflowing with empathy and solemnity, and uttered the two final keywords to completely break the suffocating cocoon of anxiety: surrender. For a mind nurtured in a fiercely competitive environment like Silicon Valley, the concept of surrender had long been labeled as an insult, an expression of weak, pessimistic people resigned to failure. But Arthur, with a kind smile and a voice echoing profound wisdom, completely redefined that great act. He explained that surrender here did not take the form of a defeated general laying down weapons to plead for mercy from the enemy, but was an act of extreme courage of a mature consciousness. It was the active decision to let go of the arrogant illusion of control that has tortured humans since the dawn of awareness. We always delusionally believe that by the power of will and by superintelligent data analysis ability, we can steer the boat of fate through every storm, avoid every risk, and force the future to happen according to a perfect, flawless script. But the cosmic reality has never been a submissive machine following the algorithms of humans. It is a great flow, chaotic and exquisite, where every effort of coercion only brings fragmentation from within. The great surrender is the moment we stop trying to drain the ocean with a leaky basket, stop forcing the stars to rotate according to the orbits of personal expectations. Arthur's words were like a warm waterfall pouring directly into Julian's weary consciousness, washing away the heavy iron armor he had to brace himself to wear for decades. He slowly relaxed his shoulders, once tense from invisible pressures, completely removing the massive burden called a future that must be perfect. He realized he had spent his youth running after a divinely idealized version of himself, a technology savior who always believed he carried on his shoulders the great responsibility to save the world, to create human breakthroughs to prove survival value. But under the silent witness of the thousands of fire-sold redwoods, the truth was brilliantly revealed that this world has its own self-balancing ecosystem, and it does not urgently need a lone hero to save it in order to continue turning. You do not need to save the world to be allowed to be present in the present. You do not need to be a genius with history-changing inventions to have the right to breathe the fresh morning air. The privilege of living, of existing, is not a reward we must scratch and claw to win with great achievements, but is a natural grace bestowed from the moment we uttered our first cry upon entering the world. Surrender now became the gentlest embrace Julian had ever given himself, a full forgiveness for every imperfection, every weakness, and every limit of a human condition. When he accepted letting go of the steering wheel of illusion, yielding the right of control to the natural flow of the universe, every internal resistance immediately collapsed. No one had to fight, no one had to rise, no one had to fear the mistakes of tomorrow. Only an infinitely quiet space remained where the soul was free to fly without being pulled by the ropes of expectation. Julian closed his eyes, letting warm tears roll down his cheeks, washing away all the toxic dross of productivity. Those were not tears of weakness, but the pure morning dewdrops of a soul just reborn, escaped from the prison of the controlling ego. Surrender did not extinguish the life fire inside him, but on the contrary, it fanned a new fire, the fire of unconditional peace, of pure joy when being a small dust particle vibrating gently in the great dance of the stars, needing no destination, needing no reason, and forever free in this ultimate letting go. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the great redwood leaves, signaling that the moment of parting had come. Julian slowly stood up, brushed the thin moss off his trousers, and gave Professor Arthur a warm embrace, needing no flowery words to express his deep gratitude. The convertible once again rolled away from the kingdom of primordial silence, following the curve of the coastal highway northward, where the suffocating Silicon Valley was waiting. However, this time, the hands on the steering wheel were not clenched in extreme tension, no longer cold sweating from anxiety, but relaxed gently as if dancing with the rhythm of the Pacific sea breeze. Unlike the cliché liberation motifs often found in ubiquitous self-help books, where the main character, after enlightenment, sheds the mundane world, throws their phone into the abyss, and moves to the high mountains to practice for life, Julian had no intention of escaping from secular life. The 34-year-old engineer was very clearly aware that denying work, giving up society, or cutting off all connections was actually a form of expanding the ego in a sophisticatedly disguised way, a desperate effort to create a fake noble cover to continue avoiding human pain. He decided to return to the epicenter of noise, return to the complex artificial intelligence codes, to the countless flashing emails and endless projects in the city of San Francisco. He chose to face the old reality directly, but now through a completely new and clear philosophical lens. Throughout the drive back, Julian's mind reflected on a final revolutionary notion that Arthur had gently planted in his subconscious. The old professor had suggested a macroscopic hypothesis that perhaps the most advanced civilizations in the universe did not fade away, nor were they invisible, they simply stopped expanding physical distance horizontally to evolve into other deeper and more subtle dimensions. Projecting that great astronomical law into his own internal ecosystem, Julian woke up to a brilliant truth about the art of mindful living. Instead of continuing the weary loop of stretching his life forward, frantically filling time with new ambitious milestones, he began to learn to dig deep into the dimension of the present moment. We are always infected by modern society with greed, obsessed with having to live a truly vast life, experiencing many new things, setting foot in hundreds of lands, and accumulating a massive fortune. But in that race to expand personal territory, we completely forget the sacred depth of existence itself. A present moment, though it may look most mediocre and bland, like taking a sip of water, slowly chewing a piece of bread, or typing a dry line of code, actually contains an infinite, boundless dimension if our mind knows how to be present fully and without resistance there. Applying this multidimensional philosophy to daily life brought Julian a stable power that no event could shake. From now on, artificial intelligence or complex algorithms were no longer a monster threatening his survival, nor were they a gold trophy for him to prove his ego. They were simply tools, objects for him to observe and practice absolute attention and work. As the car crossed the proud red Golden Gate Bridge, entering the city center packed with skyscrapers, shrill car horns, and thick interwoven electromagnetic waves, Julian no longer felt the familiar suffocation choking his chest as before. He realized that all the hurried noise of the people passing by out there was only the waves oscillating continuously on the surface of the ocean, while deep underneath the bottom of his being, he had forever resided stably in an infinite realm of silence. Mindfulness did not require him to extinguish every mixed sound of the world, did not force him to become indifferent to the hustle of the digital economy, but it taught him how to listen to all things, tolerate all things, without losing his own quiet stillness. True liberation turned out to reside right here, right at this moment, in the heart of a prosperous city, and not in some distant, blurry nirvana. By rooting deep into each breath, into the throbbing heartbeat, and into each smallest action taking place in the present, that young man was manually creating a vast universe right inside his chest, a complete universe that did not need to expand any further distance to prove greatness, because the full presence without desire was already a most ultimate miracle of life. A few days after that fateful trip, Julian smiled and pushed open the door of the very noisy coffee shop in the center of San Francisco that had once witnessed his collapse. The sound of the coffee machine hissing shrilly, the clatter of cups and saucers, the flashing computer screens, and the hurried crowds passing each other were exactly as before, but something miraculous had changed forever. In the epicenter of that chaos, inside the young engineer now resided a stable and spacious silence that was strangely wonderful. He calmly ordered a warm cup of coffee, sat down at the familiar corner table, and quietly watched the endless wheel of the world. The emptiness that once made him suffocate and panic, through the new lens, no longer took the form of a cold, lonely black hole. It gently stretched and transformed into an infinitely blank canvas, a space overflowing with tolerance, allowing him to freely draw his own colors without judgment. He realized that the vast space of the universe or the quiet silence in the mind were not enemies to flee from, but the great mother embracing all things. This life, when shedding the heavy armor of expansionist expectations, is not originally a harsh survival problem waiting for us to strain our brains to solve at any cost to find the only correct answer. Instead, this existence is like a gentle vibrating dance among the stars, where each of us only needs to immerse ourselves fully in each rhythm of the present, singing along with the universe without needing to obsess about where that dance will lead. Sipping a little coffee, Julian smiled brightly, his eyes expressing an ultimate liberation as he officially began to live as a philosophical entertainer for his own life, no longer trying to become a technology savior, no longer racing with time, but simply enjoying fully the poetic play of being human. The story of Julian's journey to find his true self brings us a profound human lesson that amidst the era of noise and pressure to become great, the most miraculous healing medicine sometimes lies in the courage to dare to let go and allow oneself to stop. We, no matter how superior a brain we carry, are ultimately only finite beings who need to rest, need space to breathe, and need to be soothed. Do not try to break the natural limits of yourself only to burn yourself into weary ashes. Dear friends, if Julian's journey today has touched a hidden corner in your soul and brought you a precious moment of peace, please gift our channel a subscription, a like, and share this video to the people you love so that we can together spread mindful values every day. How do you feel about this story, and have you ever faced the precarious empty spaces in your own real life? Please leave a comment below so that we can listen to and understand the stories from the depths of your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful spiritual life, and may every passing day be filled with peaceful serenity. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.